Welcome, everyone, to the Deep Dive, the podcast that skips small talk and goes straight for the concepts that shape our thinking and behavior. In this podcast, cold expertise is defenestrated as warm philosophy is enthroned in an attempt to explore the field in which we're all scientists looking for answers, living well. Welcome to another episode of the Deep Dive with Dela. I'm joined today by Katrina Dela Cruz. Hi, Katrina.
Hi everyone.
It's good to have you here. And without further ado, I'd love to hear from you. What is an idea that has helped you and has been helping you live well?
Yeah, an idea that has helped me live well. This is actually something that Mark Manson talks about. He did this whole survey of people about what makes them successful at relationships, right? Or like what should you look for in a person? And his answer actually really embodied something I take very close to heart as far as like an actual philosophy that I've done. And the simplest thing is to be extremely curious about yourself and the world around you. But also to take responsibility. And it's really interesting because he applies this to relationships. He says, when you look for a partner, like kind of the two most important things you look for is, are they curious about themselves and can they take responsibility for who they are? And I just loved the simplicity of that because I feel like that has been something I implicitly have taken on as a belief since I was very young. Like I have lots of journals where I'm introspecting, but I've also been very mindful of also closing the feedback loop where it's not just learning for the sake of learning, but finding ways to actually challenge myself to improve as far as taking responsibility for the things that I want to improve on and the things that I learn. So there's a very simple, it's like the very simple idea. And then kind of tangential to that and the way that I've really supported that is like there's a specific framework that I learned recently that I think has been really life-changing for me. It's Carl Jung's work around cognitive functions. If you're familiar with Myers-Briggs MBTI, it's actually the theory underlying that. So Myers and Briggs, they used Carl Jung's original theory to formulate the survey to generate the 4 letters, but there's actually this much more complex theory underneath that. And I'm not in the podcast, it's too complex to kind of articulate specifically, but it's kind of similar to any sort of personality or identity framework where you're observing yourself and you're observing other people and you're fitting it within this framework and using that to evaluate also paths of growth. So there's a lot to say around both of those things, but I think it's this very simple piece of being curious and taking responsibility for yourself, but also this piece of a very specific framework that I've chosen for myself to then view, use as a path of growth.
Yeah, that's actually interesting. On this podcast, there hasn't been much talk about specifically relationships and kind of what makes them successful and thriving. And yeah, intuitively, it just pops up as a very elegant and simple answer. And for you, what was there a catalyst or a certain point where you kind of shifted your attention into relationships for a reason, or is it just something that emerged out of a general curiosity about things?
That's a great question. I think it's always felt like something inherent to me. I can't really attribute it to a certain point in my life where I was like, I'm bad at relationships and I'm going to now get better at them. I think that for whatever reason, I was blessed with just navigating friendships and relationships really well. I think that's part of just my upbringing. Like I have strong relationships with my parents. We had arguments, but I was in an environment where I learned how to manage conflict within my arguments with my family. And it was always, I learned that I could play offense in life and have a really nurturing, fulfilling life if I learned how to navigate these conflicts really responsibly. So I think there was just something in my environment that taught me how to navigate those well by way of just being surrounded by people who made it safe to engage in in conflict. Like Brene Brown calls it like the rumble. Before I even like knew that was her term for it, I realized like that was what I was doing, which is to engage fully in conflict and then come out of it better. So I like had that experience with relationships, with my family, with my brother, with friends, until I realized it was something that I was generally very good at. And it lent a lot to the quality of life I have, is to pay very close attention to the quality of my relationships, and in a very active way.
Yeah. And do you find yourself to be a kind of peacemaker at heart, or somebody who's putting a lot of emphasis on the harmony between people in their lives, or trying to find the motivation there? Because I don't think it comes to anyone this naturally to really dig for the things that make relationships successful.
Mm-hmm. That's a great question. I do think it's something that felt very natural. But what's interesting, going back to like the theory that I was talking about, like just to keep it in simple terms, that if more people might be familiar with like MBTI, like there are certain personalities that are just generally more agreeable, right? Or in the theory, it's like there's certain people that are just more attuned to people's emotions. And I feel like that's the category I fit in. I've always felt very attuned to people's emotions. And combining that with a deep curiosity for like the intricacy of how relationships work. Like I love reading books about how to love better, quite frankly. Like one of my favorite books is The Art of Loving. Like I love that title alone, that implies that loving is something you can get better at. It's a craft. So I think it's a combination of being someone who's just very attuned to people's emotions, but also a deep curiosity over sort of the craft of relationships, and reading deeply into anything I could find that could help me improve that.
Yeah, I really like hearing you say that you're attuned to other people's emotions, because that's not empathy, right? Empathy is actually taking on those emotions and feeling literally the same as they're feeling. And that can be, I feel, detrimental. So I think it's Paul Bloom, the psychologist, who wrote a lot about how we really put empathy on a pedestal when really it can be destructive. So you want to be attuned and understand other people, but then remain curious and grounded to actually help them go through what they're going through, instead of just taking on their emotion and then mirroring their reaction, which could very well be aggressive if they're angry, or despondent if they're depressed, and so on. So I really like this framing as being attuned to emotion, not empathetic completely.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and it's so true about actually taking responsibility, because it's also making me think about about possibly what could the antonym be, right? What could the opposite be? And I'm thinking it's victim mentality, probably. And I'm just running in my mind those scenarios of meeting people who things always happen to them, and the world makes them behave the way they behave, and that seems to be the exact opposite of taking responsibility. And I wonder if you've also encountered that in your life and was turned off by it, to say so.
100%, yeah. I've encountered it in a very close relationship of mine. And so I think that also is like when something affects you that deeply, like sort of the martyrdom of people around me. And also like I recognize in ways that I've been susceptible to, putting myself in the position of a victim, especially. I'm like a self-proclaimed like people pleaser. Like I know what I am. Like I know what my tendencies are. And I've really worked at that, because I've also engaged with other like individuals who have these same sort of tendencies. And I'm like, when you go so far in taking on other people's emotions, or, the sort of like, I do it because I love you kind of language. I read a whole blog post about this. It's love in the guise of selflessness, like pure selflessness. It's like, there's a line, right? When you're assuming like what's best for other people, or being a victim, like these are versions of quote unquote love that just go too far. It's too much of an extreme. If to balance it out with just being responsible for yourself and always knowing where the line is. So yeah, it's interesting because like I know my tendencies. Like I know that I can be in the position of being a people pleaser. Like I've felt the pull of like wanting to just like I take on people's emotions too much. And I really had to learn how to like not do that. I've really had to like bring people into my life and observe other people's ways of being that taught me otherwise. And I think that's one of the most important ways I've learned to take responsibility for myself, is to know sort of where my weaknesses lie, and also be really proactive and not hurting other people by way of not taking responsibility for myself.
Yeah, so it's actually bringing up something which, since the beginning, I was just thinking about myself, that maybe relationships are just an arena where this becomes very clear, that the victim mentality doesn't serve you and taking responsibility for action does. But really in our own, right, in the individual, it's just the same, right? So if your story to yourself is that you are a person who just suffers from things and is a victim of accidents and all that, that makes it really easy. And it's actually something that I've thought a lot about in my life, because I could see the turnaround in myself around the time I turned 19 or 20. I just, a lot of the things that I read about kind of matured into this notion that life is more absurd than we make them out to be usually. And because of that, we can be more absurd and actually break away with patterns that we've had for a while and adopt new patterns. And everything is more malleable and plastic than we usually imagine. And that's what I did. And it was a big turnaround for me. And it was exactly that, right? Like taking responsibility and just seeing myself as somebody who is proactive, as you say, about doing these things. And I wonder if you've read or you've thought about any techniques for doing that, or where does the victim mentality come to play in the first place? Is it just because it's easy to sustain an ego, or is it not a question of easy and hard, but of just a tendency to identify yourselves with something?
That's a great question. Where does the victim mentality come from? My first gut answer is like, I think part of it is realizing I find that there is a joy in having integrity. Like I guess the more that I do this, the more that I take responsibility for myself. It comes back in my life, and I see how the way in which my life is just better, and it feels like, if I have an association, like it feels good, even though it's hard sometimes to take a different route that feels uncomfortable. But it's like the road of like having integrity or showing character or challenging myself. I just have this connection that it just feels good. My life feels better and clear. It feels honest. It feels aligned. I'm sure there's something been like, what sort of started myself down that train of being able to like make that association. But I feel this resistance to like believing that I'm at the whim of like my life. I don't like the feeling of, being a victim. And I'm sure I've been in a position before. Like I can recall times in my life where I almost fell into that position where, there was a period a few years ago where I was sort of just in that, like, I was in a place where everything was wrong. Like where what I was doing for work was not right for me. A relationship was not right for me. And there was so much like existential dread, like as a part of that. But then something kicked in, that was like, I just value the power of choice so much. Somehow I come back to that. I come back to reminding myself that I can choose. And I think that might be something in whether or not you take on a victim mentality or not, is like, you have a lot of agency, and not letting go of the power of choice. I think is like a starting point, because that's when I was like at my worst of feeling like a victim to the way that my life had ended up a few years ago. it was like the power of choice that reminded me, like, I started putting down like all of my fears. I tried to break everything. I literally made this spreadsheet called Let's Get Excited About Life. And I broke down all my fears. And looking back at it now, I was like, wow, I was in a really terrible place. But it was this crucial moment in which I just reminded myself that I had a choice and I needed to be really grateful for that and use whatever I had at my disposal to make changes. Because I think there's also this, I just don't like the idea of living my life unconsciously at all. Like I see it in the world, like when I see victim mentality around me too, there's a feeling of like, I see the way it inflicts people close to me when other people stop taking responsibility for their lives. If it looks like this sort of, you're asleep at the wheel. And when I observe that too, it's also motivation for me to be like, to make a choice there and say to myself, that's not something that I want for myself. That looks like just eternal unhappiness, to not be in integrity, to be a victim, to not see the ways in which I myself am contributing to my own suffering. Like I want to be awake at the wheel, conscious, and I want to be able to make choices. I hope that spurs some thought around that.
It does, because it makes me now interested in your role as an educator. I try in my life, giving my daughter as much freedom to choose as possible. So she's 3.5, and there are a lot of things that she can't decide on, right? She can't decide for herself. But I'm really trying to preserve some core feeling that, whatever is okay for her to choose, she should do it, not me. And I'm in the opinion that I should also let her make mistakes if they're non-lethal, right? So it's very simple. She wants to wear something that's way too hot for the summer. Let her boil in that silly winter dress if she wants to, because I do view the preservation of agency as being more important than, is she going to suffer from heat now? Because she can change clothes. But I think that we tend to want for children to have such a perfect life and optimize it for them, that we're trying to manage everything around to allow it for them, right? And this is basically helicopter parenting. And I want to ask you as an educator, if what you see with parents and in the education system, maybe that's a place where things go wrong when it comes to preserving agency and the understanding in children that they can choose. Like, is it actually funneling us down through a path where we end up having victim mentality more often than we should?
Yeah, so that's interesting, the way that our education system kind of sort of prepares and primes for whether or not you feel agency in your life or not, and how that sort of sets up an individual for that behavior in the rest of their lives. That is a big part of like Montessori, for example, is teaching kids that there are natural consequences to things. There's a big thing about like farm schools, right? Because your decisions have real consequence, and using the word consequences in just very neutrally, like not punishment, right? It's not you're getting an F on a thing because and that has implications for your life. It's like there's real natural consequence to if you don't take responsibility for X thing. Like you can see your impact on the community. You can see your impact and then this is something that's just very important to teach, is the ways in which your choices lead to something and the significance of them. Giving children responsibility. For example, like one thing is like small children are entrusted with like real cups instead of giving them like plastic cups, because it's like instead of giving a plastic cup and you're giving a real cup, it's like teaching a child that they do have the ability within them to take responsibility for this important thing. It's entrusting that, but at the same time that you're entrusting and you're expressing and creating an environment of like a child taking responsibility and seeing the natural consequences, you're still the adult. You still have to meet each child where they're at and understand, where are the guides? There are guides, not complete, like just throw a child into some room and they figure it out for themselves. It's like we call it a prepared environment, a space in which it's intended to simulate something to teach a child that the world has natural consequences and they can take responsibility for that. But it's also still a simulated space in which there are guards, right? Because as we are the adults, we are the individuals who are still guiding students through this process. And we call our teachers guides very specifically for that purpose. So I do think there is a lot to the existing natural environments. Maybe when I didn't do Montessori when I was a kid, but I do think my parents, they didn't, they really let me just explore myself. They encouraged me with books. And I was in a lot of adult environments. I was exposed to places where I wasn't like my independence was respected as a child. So I got to express that and explore that. I think that was probably a big thing, even though I wasn't myself like in a Montessori school. I had a lot of elements of different parts of my life that were Montessori-like, I would say.
Yeah, it's super interesting for me to think back and see what kind of influences I had that made me eventually think of that. But I think I'm a survivor in that sense. I think that I went through an education system that did not really encourage that, and I'm happy that I came out with that anyway. And many people do, but I think that we can do a much better job of preserving that in children, because I see my daughter wanting to take responsibility for things, and the easy things for us is not just to optimize it for her, but also save us trouble, right? So don't draw on that thing, or don't carry the glass cup, as you say, the glass mug, because it might break and so on. We're just afraid that it's going to create work for us. And also the optimization thing is very interesting, because it's part of the beef I have with this movement of trying to optimize things, is because basically when you optimize, you think of the best way to be, and you're becoming laser focused about achieving that, not leaving much room on the right and the left to kind of deviate from that, when it's super important to realize that there is a range of acceptable behaviors and a range of good decisions. It's not just about making the best decisions, because that's absolutely paralyzing if you have to figure out that what you're going to do next is going to create the one and only desirable result. And it's very interesting, these questions about agency. And I don't know if I have a point here, but just to kind of illuminate yet another aspect of it and say, yes, this is something that I feel like could be done a lot better by educators and parents.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I very much feel proud of the work that I do. Is so much for me to learn. I don't have perfect answers. I myself am very new to Montessori, but I feel very blessed to a lot of the things that I feel helped me become independent, responsible young adult. We're putting in practice within our own schools, and it feels good to know that the independence that I get to enjoy in a way that's also like, I know how to take responsibility for myself. I enjoy my agency. I enjoy, I don't feel like a martyr or a victim. My life feels like mine. And I want to do my best to ensure that the students we have the tools to do the same. That every student has. What started me in education was, I remember being in like high school and already having these sort of rage against the machine moments. Who gets to choose like what I have to learn, and what's the purpose of this, and just being extremely inquisitive about the system I was in. And I had some great teachers, and I was really thankful for that. But I just have always wanted to. I've just always wanted to be in education and find better ways to serve students, because I myself was like upset at some point,
Yeah, that exactly. The rage against the machine is really quite interesting. Why we even get to that point, or why it's there. And another aspect I can find it in is politics. For example, when you see whole nations really working out to beat out the agency out of people so that they do nothing, even though to us observers from the outside, it's quite clear what you can achieve with a few good decisions, right? So to speak of current events, of course, the people of Russia could topple down the Putin or something like that if they wanted, and this is true for any kingdom at any point in time. Like the people always have this power, and yet there are ways to make it seem that their choices really don't matter. And when this is done over decades, maybe centuries, you see that there is some sort of inherent helplessness in people that just keeps trickling down generations. And it's really important that we acknowledge this, and also very interesting to think about ways how to solve this. So I'm definitely interested, now that you brought up the whole idea of taking responsibility, in really making the change and making the shift. And it's very interesting to think about what could be some of the ways out of the cul-de-sac that is just saying, well, life happens, right? Because we do grow up with these maxims about life that this is just how things are. It's like love hurts. So you better expect it from whoever you're going to be in a committed relationship, and that they will hurt you because that's how things are. And how many people live with that as what they think is an understanding of law.
Yeah. I think something that's so important is recognizing the value of people who make a change by way of just embodying better living. Instead of like going out and telling people like this is the way to live, really just living well, right? And then letting that energy showcase itself, affecting others by way of, and then someone can be curious, like, Kat, you seem very well adjusted and happy. And what happened? And then I would love to share like the things that I've experienced, but it's just people, it starts off with the question of like, can I be happier? And then seeing that elsewhere, like, oh, I remember when I was in my lowest a few years ago, it was a friend of mine who sort of just woke me up. And he told me about his own journey, overcoming his own journey, choosing to take responsibility of his life. And I saw him at a place in his life where he was just much happier and I was feeling miserable. And so I just gravitated towards this person, I asked questions, and it really inspired me to take responsibility. So it's kind of it has this domino effect of, I think, as one person takes responsibility for themselves and also enjoys the integrity that comes from that and lives that through and exudes that. The hope is that other people, see that as an example and ask questions. That's really a lot of what happened to me is I feel like I looked up to the right people. I had a sort of an eye for wanting to find people who are just really happy and living life the way that I felt I wanted to live, and then asking questions from there.
Yeah, I think so too. And reading, I think there are some novels that are exceptionally good at kind of walking us through actions and their consequences and what it's like to be out in the world, either as a victim or as somebody who's just kind of fumbling for solutions around and seeing what happens to them, or somebody who is taking responsibility and making conscious choices and where that leads us. This seems to super important. To take it back to relationships, what are other things that you see that are related to this change or to this mode of taking responsibility that just make them better?
Well, I guess like one way that I take responsibility in relationships and in relation to relationships is I've sort of developed a habit to always engage in the rumble. I mentioned this word earlier. The rumble is like Brené Brown's term for when you like engage in conflict, you lean into the hard conversations and you come out of it better. Communication is so important to me. It's something that like one of the things I hate the most is miscommunication, where people are arguing over things and and you just realize like people are just not interpreting reality the same way. There's there's information missing that makes this conflict continue. And it's like a habit. It's almost like I have this streak of like, I can't really even think of a conflict I've had where I haven't attempted to resolve it very actively. And it's just a habit that I've built. I think just being really consistent with that, like as a personal standard, like I have a responsibility to talk to someone about how I feel. I put my cards on the table, and doing that over and over and over again. It's really made it a lot easier to take responsibility in my relationships, because it's every time I sort of, we win, quote unquote, we win, as in the relationship overcomes and our friendship is better, or relationship is better. It proves to me, it builds my skill set of like, it proves to me that this is always a good thing to talk things through. There are times in which some people can be manipulative. You're working with you're speaking to someone who's unwilling to engage in that same thing, and then you learn to walk away. And I've learned that as well. But I'm really fortunate that the people in my life are also people who engage in the rumble, who lean in, and show me that it's safe to put my feelings out, to talk things through, to work it out. I feel so very passionate about this. It's like, if you're going to enter my life in any way, we have to have honest conversations together. I cannot be dishonest about showing how I show up in this relationship. And I say relationship like non-platonic, like very platonically, and all encompassing, friendship, family, romantic, anything.
Yeah, absolutely. I really love it, because it's, in one sense, like being confrontational and out there and aggressive. I'm not saying that's a good thing, but in a sense, addressing things, even if in the wrong way, like maybe you could make the way better and be a better listener and keep things civil and all that. But still, I think it is better to point out that there is a problem, even if it comes out in some sort of a more aggressive way, than just kind of falling into a pattern of just living with it, just kind of giving up on this other person. I think eventually that is probably more of a reason for breaking up non-platonic, or let's say committed relationships, or relationships in a family or friendships. It's just maybe friends is somehow less dramatic. But if you've taken a vow to keep together with someone and you just fall into a pattern of there's this problem here and misunderstanding, but we're not even addressing it anymore, well, then that creates a norm of just going forward, where it's a fact that both people are not getting out of life all that they could get. And this can just, and will just build up resentment over many years. And at that point, you can just hope that these people know to walk away from one another, right? Because the thing is ruined if there is some sort of rock or boulder that there isn't even any strength to try and move it at all. That's the beginning of the end, right? An unspoken problem, would you say?
Oh, absolutely. Yes. That is a great way to put it. It's the beginning of the end, an unspoken problem. And even, you're right. And even if it's in an imperfect approach, to be able to say, like, hey, this made me feel this way, and I'd like to work with you. I'd like to work together to resolve this. And I hope it sounds so simple. It feels easy for me to say that, because I'm really grateful that I have people in my life who are really responsive to that. Not every person out there is going to, respond to that maturely. And that's the sad thing. That's the hard part, where it teaches that it's actually unsafe to share how you feel, to resolve. And so that's why this is such a high bar for me. It's like this untainted, well, it's, I've definitely encountered places where it doesn't work, but as much as possible, like, I want to maintain the integrity of communication, basically, as much as I can. There's like a line, like, how you show up with one thing determines how you show up with everything, I feel like there's like one way I think about, and this is something that I think about a lot. I just remembered, when I'm engaging in a conflict with one person, I'm not just thinking about the conflict in front of me and the person in front of me. I'm also thinking about how that is going to influence future relationships. future conflicts. Because if I shy away from this, I might shy away from other things. If I can't confront my mom about something that we're struggling with and resolve it, how am I expecting to be a good parent to my child in the future, down the line? To me, in my brain, there's a common thread and of how I respond to this affects how I respond to other things. And so that's why for me, it feels more high stakes for the sake of like, what I'm learning and my integrity across these experiences. Because it teaches me skills that all carry over across every single conflict, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does. And, the whole thing really is about taking responsibility. It's about, again, not just doing good unto others and being a good friend or family member or whatnot, but it's really being good, doing good unto yourself, right? Because you have that integrity. And I really like the word integrity because it's wholesomeness, right? If you literally translate the Latin, it's just being wholesome. And being wholesome is in some sense being healthy. And to me, mental health is the hallmark of living well. Or so for as long as you enjoy mental health, you are living well. And that's something that's really important, to be able to know how to care for yourself. And relationships are a good way to see where we stand with this, because actually introspecting and checking our own mental health can be detrimental, because you're kind of stopping to ride the wave and instead you're just becoming going inside and you can disrupt the flow. But seeing how your relationships work out is actually a fantastic way of doing it. And it's also very important to be able to give up on relationships where this is just so far, something is so broken that you can't fix it. And this is the hard part with relationships, I think, is when people realize that finally. So I mentioned divorce, but of course it's just as hard if it's your friend that has been your friend since preschool, but your ways have parted at some point, and now you find yourself unable to kind of maintain this reciprocal responsibility taking behavior, right? And this is something that not many people think should be done. I think it's not normal, for example, to see families that are torn by conflict. So yes, on the one hand, this is tragic, right? On the other hand, it's also, if you look inside, you could see a heroic act by someone to know to disengage when things should be. It probably would have been worse if they stuck around, right? So there's a word to be said for being able to walk away from toxic relationships.
1,000%. This encompasses a major chapter of my life, and this big lesson of also learning that there's a point. The part of taking responsibility is also knowing when to walk away, knowing when something's not working, or knowing when something's just incompatible. Because, and everything I just said about wanting to maintain the integrity of working through conflict, I also at a point in my life had realized there's a little bit of it's a bit too mechanical sometimes to think that, every conflict can be resolved. Not really. I mean, I had experiences with people where we could, someone that I dated, where we could do the conflict resolution, but the conclusion was always the same, in which there was this very distinctly incompatible thing that we could talk through it very amicably, but we had to just come to a conclusion at some point, which was this isn't working. And that was a major lesson that I'd learned, when and how to walk away. And I think that's very true of family too. I'm Filipino, and family is a core piece of our culture. You don't really walk away or abandon. It's almost like you can't. But it really rocked my world to realize, if you're in a toxic family, I don't, but I have friends who have been in toxic family relationships who have, left their family for reasons that I think I realize are very fair, very reasonable, because if something's really not serving you and it's harmful, and you're trying to set boundaries and those boundaries aren't being honored, it makes absolute sense to walk away from something. So yeah, that's the other half of it, where you're managing your relationships with other people, but you're also very much managing your relationship with yourself, because they are synergistic, ultimately.
Yeah, absolutely. And I remember Louis C.K. making a joke about it, about how people would say, if he tells them, oh, I've been going through a divorce in the past few months, they'll be like, oh, that's terrible. And it's like, no, that's awesome. It means that we finally recognize that things can be better, and we should just go for it. So I think that's a big part. I also want to think just shortly about Jocko Willing is this Navy SEAL who's been doing the rounds of the podcast and other venues. And he talks about extreme ownership, which is basically this idea of taking responsibility, but in his own words, in an extreme way. And there, I always had the feeling that anything done to the extreme is not right. So I want to inspect and kind of see if this can be taken too far, what happens exactly. And I assume that you just crush yourself or something.
I love this question so much. I've read that book, Extreme Ownership. I really enjoyed it. And I have reflected actually of what extreme of extreme ownership is too extreme. Because as someone, I've noticed this quality of myself of I tend to overtake responsibility. Like I put so much responsibility on myself when it comes to work, when it comes to relationships, where it's also detrimental. And what that means is I have this imperfect model in my head that relationships are 50-50, but they really aren't, right? To split everything in the middle and say it's always like, there's always something for someone to take responsibility for. But I really do, and I don't have a perfect answer to this. I really do struggle with the nuance of like, sometimes like something is not someone's responsibility. Like I fall into the trap of like not knowing what justice is if I've been hurt, because I'm, even if it might be a position where I literally did nothing to evoke something bad that happened to me, but I'm still asking myself, what did I do in that situation? And that I've noticed is kind of a dangerous situation to be in, because it might be put myself in a position where the other person is absolved of taking their own responsibility, right? Like both sides have to really have to ask that question and really explore it in its nuance. It can't be just one person. So I really, that's the question that I'm really wrestling with right now. And it's a great one.
Yeah. Well, the image that comes to my mind is just basically a juggler who's just taking too many balls to juggle, right? Because of this agency. Yes, I can throw 1, 2, 3, 4 balls at the same time from an expert juggler. But then, eventually even the best juggler can't handle X amount of balls, and everything crumbles. And I think it's true for ourselves, for everyone too, that we can just find ourselves that we're grinding ourselves to dust if we just take on more and more and more things. And like you say, so I still have beef with his term extreme, because extreme literally means the most.
Right. Well, what's interesting is actually, when he tells the story of how he came about, what inspired the book, what happens in that story is he takes extreme ownership over, because he's like the highest leadership position, right? But what comes after is actually really important, is that other people followed his example and took their own ownership. So it's not the message of the book isn't Jocko Willink took extreme ownership and succeeded because he took all of it and no one else stepped in. It's he acted as an example to take extreme ownership and inspired everyone else to take ownership as well. And then it balanced out and everyone worked cohesively as a team. I mean, that's like a very perfect scenario. There's like a lot of implications of the quality of relationship between the people in the team and their ability to step in. But I do think I think it's important to recognize sort of the other half of the picture there too. But sometimes you do take extreme ownership and then everyone's like, all right, cool, you got it. And,
okay. Yeah, no, well, it's really good that one of us actually read the book, and thank you for the correction, because it makes sense actually, making yourself almost a caricature for a while so that others can see you and take on the same behavior. That does make sense. And I do hope for him that they did see it for what it was, a technique to drive the point home rather than just being happy with doing everything. And being a model like that maybe is a decent way of making people realize that they can step up. And if they had taken, 50% or whatever of the load, then the load is going to be better dispersed over the people's shoulders. That's.
Oh, sorry. There's a line that my therapist would tell me, actually. And it's to know what's mine, to know what's yours. Like, it encompasses something for me that I find really important is when you're in conflict or you're taking responsibility for things, it's like, how do you parse out between two people, what's mine and what's yours? What's my emotion? What's your emotion? What's my responsibility? What's your emotion? And that doesn't imply like this sort of imperfect model of my head of 50-50. It's just being realistic. Like, what is mine to work on? What is yours to work on? And I find myself repeating that line in my head. And it grounds me in the teamwork when it comes to taking responsibility or having conflict. And I find that really helpful.
Yeah, for sure. And what would be a way of doing it? Is it just discussing things together, or what would be a technique to actually find exactly that?
Mm-hmm. What's mine? What's yours?
Mm-hmm.
I think there's a book that I'm reading called Conscious Loving I'm really enjoying a lot. I think one version of what this looks like is if two people, you take two people who are really curious about themselves, who are self-aware, and they can own, what's coming up for me that's unconscious that I'm bringing into this conflict, and someone else bringing, having that same introspection and bringing up for themselves what they might be projecting. It's both people taking responsibility, but also knowing specifically what is theirs to deal with very specifically. I can't do the other person's work of exploring their unconscious. I can't do the other person's work of knowing what they're projecting. So it makes it really distinct of like, also, where's the line of what I can't step over and take responsibility for, because it's literally not mine. It's impossible for me to tap into that for someone. Yeah, that does sound important, and a good thing if we can find out what it is exactly that is mine and what it is that is yours. Yeah, thanks so much, Katrina. I'd love for you to kind of tell listeners where your thoughts can be found, or any more deep and wise thoughts on your side are there, and also what you do, and any other words that you'd like to add. Thank you. I like to I muse about education and love, and I wax poetically sometimes on Twitter at Katrina DLC. That's primarily where I put most of my thoughts in writing. And if and when I do end up creating like a Substack, my information will be there too. But it's primarily Twitter, where I just put out some thoughts. And then, that's what I got. So you can find me.
That's lovely. And I'm so happy we got to do this at my 7 a.m., your 9. It wasn't easy to coordinate, and I'm happy we finally did. And this has been a pleasure to have this conversation, and of course looking forward to catching up at some point and keeping this alive.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for the invitation to be on this podcast. I really do feel honored to be here. Thank you.
You're welcome. My pleasure. So have a good night.
Good night.